Indie MMORPGs are incredibly hit or miss. Rarely do any of them ever make it past the initial early access phase, and ones that do stick around tend to have an incredibly low player base. But that doesn't mean that there isn't passionate developers behind these games. I've covered a couple of these indie titles, like Embers Adrift, Genfanod, and Brighter Shores. There are quite a few on the horizon still in development, but one that released very recently in December to early access was Pantheon: Rise of the Fallen. Developed by Visionary Realms, Pantheon is a buy-to-play fantasy MMORPG in early access that looks to follow in the footsteps of EverQuest and other early MMORPGs, as well as incorporate modern MMORPG mechanics, giving a blend of modern and retro. Now, Pantheon has quite a bit of history behind it compared to some of these other indie titles. The game started as a Kickstarter campaign all the way back in January of 2014, but unfortunately it did not meet its goal. Funding instead came from crowdfunding via the Visionary Realms website, and over the next couple of years, the game would go through quite a lot of ups and downs. Brad McQuaid, the co-creator of EverQuest, was the founder of Visionary Realms and was the creative vision behind the game, hence why its roots were so close to EverQuest, essentially looking to be a spiritual successor to the massive franchise. His vision was rather simple. He wanted to bring back the adventure and socialization of classic MMORPGs, experiences that would encourage players to group up, work together, make friends, and tackle difficult but memorable challenges as a team. However, in 2019, Brad unfortunately passed away, but Visionary Realms continued development despite the tragic loss. Nearly a decade later, the game released under early access in December of 2024 as a buy-to-play title with a price tag of $40. Of course, early access means the game is not complete. It's going to be full of bugs, glitches, missing content, and in this case, it's even subject to player wipes. Surely the $40 price tag is an insane ask for players, but the crazy part is that the game has actually been able to hold a steady player base of around 5,000 to 6,000 players. When the game released, I was curious enough to take the plunge and spend the $40 to see if it was worth jumping into. So is the game worth spending $40 for essentially a beta test? Well, let's talk about Pantheon. With Pantheon being released as an early access title, all you need is a Steam account, pay the initial $40 cost, and you can begin playing. No subscription fees, no cash shop, no pay to win, just the one-time purchase price. Now keep in mind, because the game is in early access, there is a ton of features, content, and general gameplay aspects not implemented yet. So I'm talking about the game as it is right now. Obviously in the future, there will be things added that may address some of my concerns, so just keep that in mind. Once you get in-game, you are greeted with the server selection screen where you'll have various server choices, all with various different regions. Pick a server that represents your region of the world, and you are then brought to character creation. Character creation in Pantheon is very reminiscent of classic MMOs, namely EverQuest, of course. Currently, there is 6 playable races, with more coming in the future. As of now, there is human, ogres, halflings, elves, dwarves, and darkmers. Each race has various stat distributions and class restrictions, so keep in mind that unfortunately, not every race has access to every class. The class choices currently available are Cleric, Dire Lord, Enchanter, Monk, Necromancer, Paladin, Ranger, Rogue, Shaman, Summoner, Warrior, and Wizard. Once you choose your race and class, you are given 2 points to allocate to your various starting attributes, from Strength, Stamina, Agility, Dexterity, Constitution, Wisdom, Intellect, and Charisma. Hovering over each stat will give information on what each one does, so plan your stat choices accordingly based on what you are playing. You also have the option to change your character's look looks, slightly, with a few hair color, and facial hair options. Then once you choose a name, you begin in your starting zone, which depends on your race or class choice. The game has a real hands-off approach, with no real tutorial being present, except for these little informative prompts that give basic information. You don't even get any sort of story or lore cutscene to present the world of Pantheon. Instead, the game encourages exploration, very much like classical MMOs. It expects you as the player to talk to each NPC you find and explore the world around you. Lore isn't presented to you in a fancy cutscene, but is instead given to you via character dialogue or quests. Or they just don't have the budget to make a fancy cutscene. Either way though, when you begin, you'll start exploring the game's world, which feels pretty big and filled with things to do, especially for early access. Which is good because exploration is part of the fun here, and the game doesn't look too bad. Sort of like early World of Warcraft with a lot of Unity placeholder assets. And I know this is gonna sound really simple, but the fact that not only can you swim in the game, but you can climb surfaces like in The Legend of Zelda Breath of the Wild, it adds a ton to exploration. Basically, if you see something interesting off in the distance, odds are you can get to it. The world of Pantheon is vast. Environments are relatively colorful, with character models and environments having a slightly cartoony stylistic look. Music and themes, when there are any, take a more atmospheric approach. Rather than having combat themes, catchy tunes, or emotional scores, the game has a very light complementary musical track. This isn't a bad thing necessarily, but there is only a few tracks unfortunately, so in most cases, you won't even hear any music while you play. As you explore and get a feel for the game, the main gameplay loops you'll have to interact with is combat, quests, crafting, and progression. Combat in Pantheon is a simple tab target combat system we've seen a million times in MMOs. You can target any enemy by either clicking on them or pressing tab and begin attacking them by using abilities or spells via your hotbar. Nothing innovative to the genre. So while yeah, combat is incredibly simple, luckily it does feel good. I've played quite a bit of early access MMOs where the combat lacks in speed or oomph, but thankfully here it feels just right, especially with how classes play their specific roles. Each class feels so unique with how they play, and it only gets more and more complex as you level up and get more abilities. Partying is essential in Pantheon around level 10, since normal enemies start to get really difficult around that range. So solo players, you are gonna struggle a bit here, but it is technically possible to level up completely solo. For those who remember the good old days of XP camping or named enemy farming for rare loot in EverQuest and Final Fantasy XI though, you will love the emphasis on group gameplay here, and since every class and role feels mechanically unique, every player will be useful, and it only gets more fun in higher levels. Just be careful in those difficult fights because death is punishing here. Not only do you lose your inventory until you get back to your body, but you also lose experience. And yeah, it's possible to level down if you die enough, so I think most players will want to avoid dying. Progression in general has a lot of different systems in place for character growth that is inspired from other MMOs. Unfortunately, most just aren't implemented quite yet. Of course, there is your character's level, which determines what abilities and spells you have, what equipment you can wear, and measures your overall power at the surface. Then you have a bunch of other systems at play, like your skills, masteries, rare equipment, and reputation. However, I wouldn't say there is a massive amount of customization and progression between players of the same class. Usually just a difference in maybe equipment choices or perks based on the race you chose. Questing in Pantheon, of course, takes the old school approach where you have to talk to pretty much much every NPC you find to see if they have a quest or not. No indicators like an exclamation point or anything like that. Quests are your standard run-of-the-mill tasks though, basically the kill X enemies, talk to Y NPC, or collect Z item, with maybe 1 or 2 unique interactions here and there. But for the most part, they are just the normal quest fare you'll see in modern MMOs, but they are a good way to gain XP or rewards while you grind at least. While you grind, you'll also be most likely working on your crafting professions as well. Players have the choice of picking 2 main professions to undertake on their character, with the gathering professions like mining, woodcutting, gathering, and skinning being available to everyone. There is quite a lot of different crafting professions to choose from, like alchemy, cooking, or blacksmith, with each profession also having a supplementary skill like smelting or weaving. Recipes are either learned from trainers or dropped from enemies. The system works a lot like it did in World of Warcraft, where each profession largely has to interact with other professions to get materials and trade goods, which encourages the growth of an in-game economy within the community. Speaking of community, the game does have a guild system, but sadly nothing else in terms of other community features. There is no in-depth faction or law system, no public or world events, leaderboards, auction house, or PvP. Heck, there isn't even really an endgame yet, and only a handful of people have actually hit max level. Technically, that's completely fine, since Pantheon knows its core audience, and that audience largely doesn't want those types of features. The game is catered to the retro MMO gamer who wants a more social, smaller experience, where the game is about the journey and the friends you make along the way, versus what dungeons and bosses you can do at max level. And I think for the most part, Pantheon succeeds at that while also having some small modern features. The biggest caveat here though is that the game is in early access. Expect things to be buggy, features to not work, and general jank to be commonplace. Out of all the early access games I've covered though, Pantheon feels the closest to its overall vision of what it wants to be, so it has a lot of potential. But I've said that in basically all of these early access videos. The game has potential. The foundation is all here for something special, and the fact that it's garnered quite a solid player base is more than I can say for some of the other MMOs out there. Hopefully the development team can fully realize that potential with however long it takes to get there. Anyways, let's get to my final thoughts. For those who are looking for a spiritual successor to old school MMOs like EverQuest, look no further than Pantheon Rise of the Fallen. The gameplay experience probably gives the closest experience to that classic nostalgia that people have been looking for. And obviously, since it's following the style of classic MMOs, it also has no cash shop and no pay-to-win monetization schemes. You just have to pay the initial upfront cost to jump in. The game has a really vast open world with tons of secrets, mysteries, and lore to discover. Anytime I roamed around in the wilds, I always found something new to discover, whether it was a dangerous enemy or a treasure chest. It felt really fun to just run out and explore. Combat feels pretty good and optimized compared to other early access games I've played, and I can't express enough how unique and fun each class plays from one another, not to mention the amount of choices in race and classes available. Sure, it still has the normal roles of tank, healer, support, and DPS, but it just has a level of quality behind it that makes it feel good to play. If you are worried about the game not having players, well, surprisingly it actually has grown to have a pretty steady player base. This is a really positive thing to see, considering most MMOs tend to lose players as time goes on, but seemingly Pantheon has either held its player base or steadily grown, which is exciting to see. Lastly, the game feels pretty optimized. I've played a few early access games that crashed quite a bit, but Pantheon didn't give me any issues, and gameplay-wise, I never suffered any significant performance hiccups. I think this one is a no-brainer, but obviously if you don't want to pay for a glorified beta test, then Pantheon is probably not the game you want to jump into yet. The game is in early access, so tons of gameplay features are just not implemented yet, which would probably be fine if the game was free, but it's not. It's got an upfront asking price of $40, which is probably turning away a lot of people looking to at least try it out. This is a double-edged sword realistically. It keeps bots and those who just want everything to be free away from the game, but those who genuinely just want to try it before they buy it sadly don't have an option to do so. And I do accept that the developers have to make money to keep the game alive. For those that are more used to modern MMOs that cater to players who prefer to solo or in general just have an easier difficulty, Pantheon is not that sort of MMO. It's designed to have some punishing mechanics to make the game feel more dangerous so that you are encouraged to group up and adventure with other players. Obviously that's not for everyone, especially solo players. Now the last point here will definitely no longer apply at some point in the future, but it's definitely going to be a kick in the groin for some people. It's the fact that the developers have stated that there is going to be character progression wipes at some point. So if you put a ton of hours into the game now, you are more than likely going to lose all of that progress in the coming years. That alone makes me want to wait for the game's full release rather than playing it right now. Pantheon has quite a lot of hype behind it, I gotta admit. The fact that it has big names from the industry behind it, as well as big content creators in full support of its development, more than likely means it will have the momentum to make a splash in the MMO market. We just might have to wait a few more years for that to actually happen though. Anyways, are you playing Pantheon Rise of the Fallen? Comment down below and let me know. Don't forget to like the video and subscribe to my channel to support my content. Follow all my social media in the description below, and I hope to see you all next time.